Before they were legends. Part 3. Henry Ford, the farm boy who failed repeatedly. History remembers Henry Ford as a titan, a pioneer, a symbol of American industry. But the record tells a stranger story. Before the empire, before the assembly line, before millions of cars rolled off factory floors, there were collapses. 2 companies that failed, investors who withdrew support, a forced removal from his own enterprise, public embarrassment, financial instability, and a reputation quietly forming, not of brilliance, but of stubbornness. Here is the anomaly. How does a man rejected twice by his own industry later dominate that same industry so completely that he reshapes global manufacturing itself? This is not a simple success story. This is a structural investigation, because something changed between failure and domination, and it changed everything. In 1863, in rural Michigan, Henry Ford was born into a farming family. His future was already written. Land ownership, manual labor, seasonal repetition. Farm life was predictable. But predictability irritated him. He did not resent work. He resented inefficiency. At 12 years old, he received a pocket watch. He dismantled it. Every gear removed, every spring examined, every mechanism understood. Then he rebuilt it. Neighbors soon brought broken watches to the boy. He repaired them carefully, free of charge, not for income, for understanding. He was not studying objects. He was studying systems. At 16, he left the farm, moved to Detroit, apprenticed as a machinist. Factories roared, metal clanged, steam hissed. Inside that chaos, he observed patterns. Eventually, he worked at the Edison Illuminating Company. There he met Thomas Edison. At a company dinner, Ford described a gasoline-powered vehicle, not pulled by horses, not dependent on steam. Edison listened, then offered quiet encouragement. That encouragement mattered. But encouragement does not guarantee execution, and execution was where things began to break. In 1896, Ford completed the quadricycle, lightweight, primitive, unstable but operational. Investors saw potential. In 1899, he launched the Detroit Automobile Company. The environment seemed ideal. Industrial growth, expanding markets, curiosity about automobiles. Yet production faltered. Costs ran high. Vehicles lacked consistency. Investors demanded faster output. Ford demanded engineering precision. Conflict followed. The company collapsed, publicly. And in the early 1900s, public failure carried weight. Reputation mattered. Credibility mattered. Ford's credibility was damaged. Many founders disappear after a collapse like that. He did not. Instead, he studied the wreckage, quietly. In 1901, Ford tried again. New financial backers, new leadership structure, new optimism. The same tension returned. Ford focused on refining mechanics. Investors focused on revenue. Arguments intensified. Control slipped from his hands. He was removed, the company reorganized, and eventually became Cadillac. The irony was sharp. The enterprise survived without him. At this point, most narratives would end. 2 failed companies, removal from leadership, diminished reputation. Yet Ford did not retreat. Something was shifting internally, and it was not about engines. Failure has a pattern. When repeated, it forces clarity. Ford began to see what he had misunderstood. He had been trying to perfect machines, but investors were evaluating structure. Production systems were inefficient. Workflow lacked coordination. Labor processes were inconsistent. He was building vehicles, but he was not yet building a system. In 1903, he founded the Ford Motor Company. This time, strategy changed, not visibly, not dramatically, but structurally. In 1908, he introduced the Ford Model T. The Model T was not luxurious. It was standardized, interchangeable parts, simplified design, minimal variation. This was not aesthetic innovation. It was operational control. Then, in 1913, came the transformation, the moving assembly line. Before it, assembling one car required over 12 hours. After implementation, production dropped to 90 minutes. Efficiency multiplied. Cost fell. Output surged. But Ford did something even more strategic. He raised wages to $5 a day. Industrial leaders called it reckless. It was not. It reduced turnover, stabilized workforce, increased productivity, and created customers. Workers could now afford the product they manufactured. Production fed income. Income fed demand. Demand fed production. A self-reinforcing loop. This was not invention. It was architecture. Ford vertically integrated operations. He acquired raw materials, controlled supply chains, standardized components, simplified choices. Any color, he famously declared, as long as it's black. Not arrogance, efficiency. The earlier failures had taught him one central rule. If control is fragmented, collapse follows. If control is centralized, stability follows. By 1927, over 15 million Model T vehicles had been sold. The farm boy who failed twice had motorized modern society. But there was a cost. The same focus that built the system began to limit it. Ford resisted updates to the Model T, clung to uniformity. Competitors, including General Motors, adapted faster. Market share shifted. Dominance is never permanent. Structure must evolve. Even architects can become trapped inside their own designs. So what was Henry Ford? A visionary? A strategist shaped by humiliation? A man who learned more from collapse than success? His early failures were not random. They were instructional. They forced structural thinking. They forced system control. They forced evolution. Without those collapses, the empire may never have formed. Nay, so consider this. Is failure evidence of inadequacy? Or is it exposure to the architecture that must be rebuilt? History celebrates the empire. But the empire began in embarrassment. Before he was a legend, he was dismissed. Next time, we open another case file. Another empire. Another story that looks simple from a distance, but isn't. And when we examine it closely, the pattern will emerge again. History celebrates the empire, the assembly line, the Model T, the dominance. But empires are not born in applause. They are forged in embarrassment. 2 failed companies, public removal, damaged credibility, a reputation for stubbornness. Most men would have retreated. Henry Ford stayed. Not because he was certain, but because he had learned something structural. Failure was not rejection. It was instruction. Each collapse exposed weakness in the system. Each humiliation forced refinement. Each loss removed illusion. By the time he succeeded, he was no longer building cars. He was building control. And that control reshaped global manufacturing. But here is the final tension. The same rigidity that built his empire later slowed it. The same standardization that made him dominant made adaptation difficult. Strength, when frozen, becomes vulnerability. So what was Henry Ford really? A visionary? A strategist forged by humiliation? Or simply a man who stayed long enough to understand the system? Because if his early failures had ended him, the modern industrial age might look very different. And that leaves us with a deeper question. Is failure proof that something is wrong with you? Or is it evidence that the structure is incomplete? History only shows the finished empire, but the pattern begins in collapse. Before he was a legend, he was dismissed. And that pattern, we will see it again. In the next case file, another empire. May another rise that looks simple from a distance, but when examined closely, reveals fractures. If you enjoy uncovering the hidden mechanics behind legendary power, subscribe now. Because this series isn't about success stories, it's about structural truth. And in part 4, we open a new file, one built not just on industry, but on influence. And what we uncover there may challenge everything you thought you understood about power. I'll see you in the next investigation.